fingertip shopping will be one of the many homemaker's conveniences. This video console will be channeled into the store of her choice. There, a camera will scan a display of wares, which she will select by push button. Another part of this console is a household monitor screen, which maintains a watch on critical areas in the house, swimming pool, or yard. What the wife selects on her console will be paid for by the husband at his counterpart console. All bills and transactions will be carried out electronically. A central bank computer will debit the family's account the amount of purchases and credit the department store, for example, informing the family's home computer at the same time. Father, at the touch of a button, receives an instantaneous printed copy of his budget, the amount of taxes he owes, the payments left on the car, and so forth. All documents and household records are available on the video screen for immediate reference. Also at his disposal is an electronic correspondence machine, or home post office, which allows for instant written communication between individuals anywhere in the world. To maintain these and hundreds of complex electronic circuits, a monitor checks all circuits every few seconds, inserts a backup circuit if and when trouble develops, and alerts the communal service agency for replacement.
With that movie, 2001, you're projecting us into the 21st century. I brought along my son, Jonathan, who in the year 2001 will be the same age as I am now. Maybe he will be better adjusted to this kind of world that you're trying to portray.
The big difference when he grows up, in fact, if we wanted to wait for the year 2001, is that he will have in his own house, not a computer as big as this, but at least a console through which he can talk to his friendly local computer and get all the information he needs for his everyday life, like his bank statements, his theater reservations, all the information you need in the course of living in a complex modern society. This will be in a compact form in his own house. He'll have a television screen like these here and a keyboard, and he'll talk to the computer and get information from it, and he'll take it as much for granted as we take the telephone.
I wonder, though, what sort of a life would it be like in social terms? I mean, if our whole life is built around the computer, do we become a computer-dependent society and computer-independent individuals?
In some ways, but they'll also enrich our society because it'll make it possible for us to live really anywhere we like. Any businessman and executive could live almost anywhere on Earth and still do his business through a device like this. And this is a wonderful thing. It means we wanted to be stuck in cities, we better live out in the country or wherever we please, and still carry on complete interaction with human beings as well as with other computers.
My guest this afternoon is from the School of Communication and Information, and Professor Aram Sinnreich, we'll spell that out for you in the video, who has kindly consented to come and talk with us about a range of issues that are involved in the internet in the 21st century. We look at it, we're always looking at a screen, I guess not if we're just texting, but looking at a screen, then the power of the visual has increased enormously. But first I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you teach here at Rutgers and how it is that you came to become a professor.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me, by the way. It's really great to be able to talk about the stuff that I geek out on with people from other fields and find those areas of common interest. I teach classes at the undergrad level. I have a class called Copyright, Culture, and Community, or it's got some name like that. And the basic aim of that class is to take a look at a very dry, very legalistic subject like intellectual property law, and to understand how these laws are used as basically a way of regulating society, of telling people what they can and can't say, and to whom, and in what kinds of contexts. Another course I teach is called Musical Cultures and Industries. And the purpose of that class, again, is to kind of look behind the kind of obvious dimensions of music. You know, when you think about the popular music industry, if you think about the people you're seeing on YouTube or Vivo or MTV, and start looking at the kind of mechanism that brings music into the marketplace and brings music from the kind of large corporations that develop musical products in front of people's eyes and before people's ears, and try to understand all the different role players, all the stakeholders, all the reasons that all the different actors along the line participate in this grand project, and to understand how new technologies are changing those processes, and to understand, given that music is such an intimate dimension of our psychic and civic lives, what those changes mean for us as human beings and as societies. Another course that I teach, sometimes undergraduate, is called Development of Mass Media. And what it looks at is the kind of 19th century of print, the 20th century of broadcast and electronic media, and then the 21st century of digital media. And once again, understanding not just, you know, how did the telephone replace the telegraph, or how did texting replace calling, but more, how has there been a kind of struggle between people's desire to share information with one another in order to develop relationships, families, communities, and societies, and the desire on the part of other parties to limit the kinds of communication that we can have, to censor communications, to surveil our electronic communications, like we recently found out the NSA does, or to go back 100 years to intercept the mail when it's sent from a post office box to someone's inbox at home, which is what the Comstock Act did at the turn of the 20th century. And understanding that there's a rhythm to this stuff, that the way that we communicate, whether we're talking about journalism or visual art or music, gives us the material that we use to create our identities and to cement our relationships. And therefore, having a certain degree of control over how that information flows is, in essence, controlling how people construct themselves and understand how they relate to other people.
Well, you raised so many things that touch buttons with me. I don't know where to begin first, but I do want to. I mean, you've done a book, a serious book on music industry, right? The piracy is mostly also about the music industry, I guess.
Primarily about.
Okay, but I'm going to push you a little bit towards Hollywood and visual, but piracy is piracy, right?
Yeah, and the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, plays a fairly large role in the piracy crusade story.
So our ability to intercept is growing. You touched another personal button. I spent many years, every summer and some winters in Croatia, which was Yugoslavia, at a time when my mail would routinely come and be stamped that it was opened by the post office. Yeah. I thought it was so nice of them to stamp it so everybody knew that they had opened it. But it had this big thing and then resealed. And
well, you know, sadly,
we're getting better at it.
That's not just something that happened in the 20th century behind the Iron Curtain. I know some people in Washington, D.C., today, in 2013. They're a married couple. They're very nice, law-abiding citizens. The husband is he's a PhD who works in education. Basically, independently helps nonprofit organizations get funding for educational projects. And the wife works for USAID, which basically invests in humanitarian projects around the world, especially in the developing world. So she spends a lot of time traveling in Africa, basically making sure people get food, water, and medicine. And this year, this couple received at their house from the U.S. mail system an opened envelope addressed to one of their friends who's a prominent journalist. Now, it wasn't mailed to them. Their names were nowhere on it. But what the opened letter to their journalist friend essentially told them is A, the mail is being read and intercepted. B, somebody knows that they have a personal relationship with this journalist. And C, they are essentially duty-bound now to tell their journalist friend. It's as though they have been made the messengers of the surveillors to tell their journalist friend that person is being watched.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to jump into something else you said, to push another button with me. You
Sure.
make a distinction between the electric age you call it, electronic age and the
Yep.
digital age. So I teach big, long surveys of things, and so my shtick is sort of oral ages to around 1,000,
Right.
scribe culture 1,000 to 1,500, print
Right.
culture 1,500 to about 1950, and then I just have a single electronic age from 1950 on, beginning spilling back to radio and then with television, and I put that all together. But you do see a fundamental difference.
Yes.
I want you to say yes, because I think that I'm wrong. I got to update my notes and when I teach, because particularly of the two-way.
That's exactly right.
The interaction is what I see as critical about digital.
Right, so-
people who talk to the radio or the television are crazy, right?
Well, if you think about it, newspapers have more in common with television news than they do
Right.
with a news website. And the reason is you have essentially one organization that is a gatekeeper that decides, what counts as news and what doesn't, who gets to be a journalist, and then finances the whole operation and sends exactly the same message to 1 million people, right? Whether you're a radio station or a television station or a newspaper publisher, you're setting up today's news. You decide how to frame it. In media studies speak, framing means, do you call people who are in favor of abortion pro-choice, or do you call them anti-life, right? That's a framing question, and the way that you frame it changes the opinions that people have. So a newspaper or a television station has tremendous power to influence people's opinions simply by reporting the news to them in different, subtly different ways that the end viewer or listener or reader might not be aware of. What digital media do distinctively from those previous media, whether they're paper or electronic in nature, is diversify the number of sources for information, and therefore diversify the number of viewpoints
Right on.
that somebody can get. And also provide lateral communications. So if I want to share a piece of news with you, in the old days I would have had to write a letter to the editor of my newspaper and say, I think you should cover this story, it's very important. And then you would have picked up the newspaper a week later and said, oh, this is a very interesting story. Now I can email you directly and say, look at this footage I took on my iPhone of this protest in Washington, D.C. You might never see it in the newspaper or on television, but now you're aware of it as a piece of news that influences your sense of the world because of that direct communication.
And I can share it with a network of friends, not
Exactly.
all of whom are even in your network, so you
Exactly.
don't know where it's going.
Right. Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm assigning students to read this opening chapter of your piracy book, and I want you to defend for me against the criticism that this is, which I don't share. I sign it because I never sign things I don't want students to know about.
Okay. It's all good.
But the critic would say this is too facile. This is icing on a cake. This is drawing a parallel that really doesn't carry us through. And yet I was very persuaded by some of the later parts of your argument when you take on that very question of how important is this, and you argue that it is even more significant in a whole variety of cultural ways than the decline of European power in the late Middle Ages.
Sure. So would you like me to kind of address that top down, or do you want me to kind of restate the argument?
Well, I'd like you to tell us. You do wonderful confessional things, which we'll get to soon. But what made you think of this? How much research did you do? You just happen to be an expert on crusades?
No, it's kind of funny.
What got you going on this, and how did you do it, and why did you decide to include it? You're pretty much your own man. I don't think the editor told you to put that in.
No, not at all. I guess, I'll tell you this, and I tell my students all the time, I think good research begins with intuition, right? You have a sense that the version of events that you're being sold is not completely accurate, and you don't know why, right? You certainly, we're all just limited human beings with 2 eyes and 2 ears at best, and we learn a little bit of information, and we try to kind of figure out what the world is like using that little bit of information. And, oftentimes, it's like when you discover that there's no Santa Claus. Sorry if that's a spoiler. You kind of, you start asking questions when you're around 4 years old, like, how does Santa Claus get to, how many kids are there in the world? There's like 500 million. How is Santa Claus going to do all that in one night? And then at some point you kind of break your parents down and they have to say, well, Junior, I'm afraid to tell you, but there is no Santa Claus that's really grown-ups. And you say, aha, you're working off that intuition. And the same applies to really any subject that you might find interesting. There's a kind of official curated version of the story of what happened to music in the age of the internet, the story of how Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Whatever historical or contemporary event it is, there is a competition over how that narrative is crafted, which goes back to the framing issue that I was talking about before. And I think it's a very helpful thing to always be mistrustful of the dominant narrative around any shared event, because somebody has a vested interest in highlighting certain elements of that story and obscuring other ones. So I've been working, this is a subject that I've been basically researching my entire adult life, because I'm a music fanatic ever since early childhood. It's affected me on a very profound level. I've always wanted to be part of it. I make music. I listen to music. The reason I married my wife is she's the only person I ever met who I could talk about, what was playing on the Muzak in a restaurant, and she would know what I was talking about without me having to bring it to her attention, because she's always listening too. So, I was very lucky to be, due to my pre-existing interests, to be a member of a party to these digital transformations in the music industry. I started working almost right out of college as a researcher at a market research firm in New York that focused on the internet. This is 15, 16, 17 years ago now. God, that's a long time ago. This is the winter of 1997. There was basically no music on the internet yet. Nobody knew what an MP3 was. There was no streaming audio. There was no internet radio, let alone peer-to-peer file sharing or Spotify or YouTube or any of the things that your students are now using to listen to music. And I got to kind of be there as computer scientists started to figure out this problem, is how do we use the internet as a way to distribute music? And remember that back then, you had to unplug your telephone, plug in your computer into a modem, and dial up at 14.4 or 28.8, a fraction of a percentage of what we get through your standard broadband internet connection or even wireless internet connection these days. And so I was working for this firm and doing research on the internet when Napster hit in the summer of 1999. And my clients were the major record labels. And my job was to basically look at these new technologies and tell the record labels and the movie studios and the other kind of major media companies that were my clients, what does this mean for you? So I did a piece of research back then in the fall of '99. It was published in the spring. And what I did was a huge survey where I sent a survey out to over 3,000 Americans. And I asked them like 50 to 100 questions about what they did with music. How much music do you buy? How much do you listen to music? Where do you listen to music? Why do you listen to music? One of the questions was, have you used this thing called Napster? Another of the questions was, in the last year, have you bought more music than last year, less music, or the same amount? And what I found out was that not only were Napster users 45% more likely to have increased the amount of music they bought than anyone else who was identical, same age, gender, income, expertise, whatever. Identical people, one of them used Napster, the other didn't. The first one is 45% more likely to have increased the amount they were spending on music. But not only is that the case, but Napster was the single greatest factor in driving people's propensity to buy more music than anything else, right? Even if they made more money than they did last year, that would not cause them to buy more music as much as using Napster would. So I went, I was very young and naive, and I went to my clients in the music industry and I said, guys, this is the greatest thing ever. This new technology is, it's going to double your business. All you have to do is get with the program, and you're gonna make out like gangbusters. And they excoriated me. The RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, stopped being my client. They issued a press release saying that I was wrong, and commissioned their own research, which was inherently biased for reasons I won't get into, basically to demonstrate that my research was wrong. And they slagged me publicly in the press. And which, if you think about it, is a very over-the-top way for a huge multi-billion-dollar organization to deal with a 27-year-old who essentially works for them, right, and is trying to help them out. So I was very confused by that at the time, and I spent a couple of years trying to work within that sphere as a market researcher to try to kind of, convince these clients of mine in the music and film industries that they needed to embrace these new technologies and not fight them. And we all know what direction they went in, right? They decided to sue Napster out of existence, and to sue MP3.com out of existence, and to sue 35,000 of their own customers over a 5-year period from 2003 to 2008, including grandparents, children, disabled people, war veterans, widows, dead people. I mean, it was an absurd I mean, you couldn't ask for worse kind of self-immolation on the part of the industry. And at a certain point, I just got frustrated, and I decided to join the academy. And you know, I thought I'd have a little more intellectual independence and be able to ask questions that I found more.
I hope you do.
On a good day, I do. I mean, you're always, you know, like Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody, right? But right now, what I serve is the citizens of New Jersey, and I'd rather work for them than for the MPAA and the RIAA. And all I was ever really interested in was the truth. And I felt I had this, you know, sense that was semi-intuitive and semi-expert based on professional research, that the story we were being told, that Napster ruined the music industry and Napster's users are all criminals and everybody on the internet is botching things for these, you know, bastions of American civilization, you know, it just struck me as being the worst kind of rhetoric that not only willfully ignored the truth, but shifted the blame onto the majority of innocent people out there for problems that were entirely self-generated. And so, so this book came about. I know this is a very long answer to your question, but it's, I hope, interesting to your students. This book came about because several times over the last decade I've been asked to serve as an expert witness in court cases. I was an expert witness for Grokster, which was one of the early file-sharing companies, and that case went to the Supreme Court. And they ultimately lost the case, although the Supreme Court had to invent a law that didn't exist in order to justify finding them liable, which I think a lot of people still have a problem with. More recently, there's a file-sharing company called LimeWire that some of your students may remember using a few years ago, and you remember using it. Yes. So LimeWire had been sued, and they'd been found liable, and it was the damages portion of the case. How much were they going to owe to the record labels? And they hired me as an expert witness to basically say, you shouldn't, you know, find them liable for $1 billion. Initially, I'm not making this up, the music industry was asking for trillions of dollars in damages, which is absurd for an industry that at its peak wasn't worth $50 billion, right? So I wrote a whole report, a very long report for them, and was deposed for a day by record industry lawyers, and was preparing to testify in court. And the day before I was going to testify, the record label settled with LimeWire for a tiny fraction of what they've been asking for. It was about $100 million, which is in absolute terms a lot of money, but relative to the damages they sought, actually very low. And I was like, oh! You know, I'd been preparing for months to make this argument, and I had, you know, I'd marshaled all these resources and done all this research, and I didn't have anything to do with it. So I called up my editor. I'd published one book before on music and technology. It's called Mashed Up, with University of Massachusetts Press, and I said, are you interested in, you know, letting me turn this into a book? And he said, yeah, go for it. It sounds great. So I thought I was doing something very crafty, and that I would take those 20,000 words I'd written and just turn each paragraph into 4 paragraphs, and boom, I'd have a book. But as it ended up, I only wound up using like maybe 5% of what I'd already written. I wrote a whole new book from scratch that I think is actually much better and more compelling. But ultimately, you know, my desire with this book is to set the record straight. Right? There are these prevailing myths that get repeated over and over and over again. Every time you're at a cocktail party, every time you read a news story, every time you hear a congressperson testifying, they say, well, you know, we need to create this new law that's going to give corporations the ability to spy on your private communications. By the way, I wrote this book before Snowden revealed anything about the NSA wiretapping. Right, and they keep trying to make these new laws. SOPA, PIPA, CISPA, you guys have probably heard of some of these. Saying, you know,
I taught SOPA people last year.
I'm glad you did. You know, everybody should know about it. And they're, you know, they're part of a perennial anti-piracy agenda that builds on itself and gets stronger and stronger every year. The basic effect of which is to limit people's ability to speak freely. It censors people. It institutes both corporate and governmental surveillance. And it creates mechanisms that allow the entrenched corporate interests in the music industry to keep newcomers out and basically prevent innovation from happening in the marketplace. And so my aim with this book is to kill the narrative that enables that process dead, so that no more can a lawmaker introduce a bill saying, this is going to save 20,000 jobs and $60 billion in productivity if we just let corporations spy on people as they travel around the internet. No, actually that's not true. It won't accomplish that. The problems that you prescribe this as a solution to don't actually exist. And the only effects it's going to have is to limit people's political power and to limit the diversity in the marketplace.
Okay, I'm not sure you hit the nail on the head as to the question of whether the historical argument strengthens. No, that's fine. Why don't we leave that to the students to discuss? Because we've got another session where the students are going to discuss with their TA and
forgot
among
altogether
themselves.
what I was talking about.
No problem, no problem. So what is the efficacy of historical argumentation? We'll leave to the students to discuss, because I want to take a few minutes.
Sorry about
that. No, that's fine. To move our discussion to the question of the visual and what the internet does in the private and personal sphere. So a person who checks out your website gets to see a picture of you.
Right.
That's nice. But you didn't put on, which is perfectly all right, a picture of your wife or your children. But maybe you do share such pictures when they were born and so forth and so on. And I certainly do with my family, but I just have this one state picture looking a little bit professorial on my website for the department. And that's it. You look a little more risque than I do. No, I'm talking about on your website picture.
Okay.
So talk to us about, and yes, I mean, you're an expert on this, certainly relative to me, and I think relative to many of my students. Where are we going with the shared intimacy of the visual? And we're not talking about pornography here. I don't want to go that direction. I want to go the direction of loving families.
That's a great question.
Can we do that?
Sure. Well, this is, as you say, we've basically lived in a screen culture for the last 100 years, right? And screens as a kind of visual medium have been around for thousands of years, right? I mean, there are, Balinese shadow puppets, right? Or, mummery in northern Europe. There are traditions that go back a long way of kind of reducing the three-dimensional world to two-dimensional images in order to make them more intelligible. And even, if you think about the origin of writing, these symbols, the letter A began as, a pictograph of a house. And there are pictographic languages like Chinese and kanji, Japanese script, that are still, you can kind of tell, oh, well, that's a tree, right? So, for as long as human beings have had the capacity to render visual information, we've been flattening the world and reducing it to a two-dimensional shadow of the three- or four-dimensional world we live in order to simplify it and make sense and communicate our feelings and our ideas to each other. And I think we've always used that as a kind of emotional prosthetic, to get to your question. There are very few homes, I think, historically, in which their paintings haven't hung, right? Or sculptures. Even if you go to traditional cultures, I've been to rural Mexico, and there are very few houses that don't have a crucifix on the wall, in addition to other forms of pictorial art. So I think this notion of having a screen that kind of captures your shared narrative and identity iconographically is a nearly universal kind of human behavior. Now, what happened about 100 years ago with the birth of cinema was that these screens became, they gained a new dimension, which was time, right? So cinema is like a photograph or a painting that changes in time. And, it began as a kind of curiosity, and people would go to little houses where Nickelodeons, where they could put a nickel in a crank machine and see a 10-second movie. But with the dawn of television in the middle of the 20th century, all of a sudden the screen was inside the house. And not only was the screen inside the house, but the screen was programmed from outside the house. So you get, instead of visual iconography serving a very kind of intimate role in the family, where, I love this painting, I'm going to bring this painting into the house. here's a picture of Ganesh, we worship Ganesh, let's put this picture in the house. All of a sudden you have a box that's essentially a black box in that you don't know how it works. You don't know where the information is really coming from. It's kind of in the air. And your kids can turn on the box, and all of a sudden they're going to get anything that's being broadcast, whether it's, back then, The Lone Ranger, I Love Lucy, or what have you. That terrified people, and I think justifiably, for the same reason that Plato was terrified that writing would destroy oral culture, which in some ways it did. Bringing that television screen into the house, I think, created a kind of power imbalance where people were not able to, if you think about a screen, all screens are really kind of boundaries, interfaces between a world of information and a world of sensation. And, the screen of a television is entirely unidirectional. There's information out there, there's sensation in here. I might be able to change the channel, but other than that, I have very little power over how that information affects me emotionally or interpersonally or culturally or what have you. And that didn't really change all that much until, there were some interesting, around the late 70s, early 80s, two very important things happened in screen culture. One of them was that we switched from a broadcast infrastructure to a cable infrastructure, which all of a sudden meant instead of having 3 or 4 or 5 channels, you'd have 3 or 4 or 500 channels to choose from. Mm-hmm. And that level of choice, I think, restored a degree of power into consumers' lives, where I don't like what's on channels 2, 4, 7, 9, or 11. So I'm going to tune into the channel that has Pat Robertson's 700 Club and bring some religious information into my household. Or, I feel like people don't act like real people on these broadcast shows because of the Ways and Means committees. I want to watch a channel where people actually curse at each other, right? Because that's how people actually behave, right? So there are all kinds of disparate value systems that were able to find a more accurate reflection of themselves in these broadcast images once cable took over. And then at the same time, you had the development of the VCR. And there was a huge court case, initially Hollywood, for very similar reasons to those they've been using to fight peer-to-peer. Hollywood fought the VCR and said, this is illegal, it's piracy, people are stealing, blah, 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 blah. And ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court in 1985 found that people have a constitutional right to time shift, to record television shows, play them back when they want, keep a library of television shows that they've recorded, whatever that you want to do with a VCR, other than record, redistribute, and sell TV shows, you should be able to do it. Personal, fair use. And so that power to kind of liberate yourself from the time, because remember that because cinema and television are images moving through time, and because they're programmed, there used to be this thing called appointment programming. NBC tried to sell it to us as must-see TV. And we still have that, if you think about the Super Bowl or you think about election returns or something like that. There are certain things that happen on television where that 50 million people or 100 million people or more are simultaneously going to be tuned in and watching it. And that used to be much more the case. You could only watch a TV show when it aired, prior to time shifting. So in addition to being liberated in terms of the amount of choice people had over what they were seeing and bringing into their homes by cable television, people were also liberated in terms of their schedules. You no longer had to be home at 8 p.m. to see your favorite show or miss talking about it around the water cooler the next day. So there was a degree of, it's almost as though there's like a torrent of water coming at us, and people suddenly got the ability to divert it into one pipe or another pipe. Now what the internet did, and I think this is, it's so cliche at this point to speak of the internet as a revolutionary technology that we almost overcompensate by being, it's just one more medium. But in reality, it is hard to overstate how profound this change is. What the internet does is, instead of just giving us power to choose what we consume, it puts us back into the process of selecting and curating our visual environment, right? We choose what's on the internet screen in the same way that we choose what kinds of paintings hang on the walls. Well, I was getting to that. Absolutely. Sorry. No, it's okay. This is a conversation. But yes, so not only have we been restored with the power, if I want to put my iPad on the wall and just have a picture of Van Gogh's sunflowers, I can do that. That's my power, the same way that I could with the painting of Van Gogh. But I can also take my iPad off the wall and I can load up, an art program on it, and I can make my own picture of a sunflower, and then I can post it to Facebook, and other people can download it and put it on their walls. And that gives me the power, as you say, to become not only a consumer, not only a curator of my visual environment, but a producer in our collective visual environment in a way that never existed in the past. So in a way, it's a technology that offers the promise, not always the reality, but the promise of a more democratized power over visual culture than we've ever enjoyed since the dawn of visual media. And I am a theorist who believes that that the power to influence information flows amounts to a form of political and social power. And because of that, I think that there is a lot of democratizing political potential in these platforms. Now, that's why I'm especially concerned, to go back to what we were talking about before, about efforts to limit people's ability to speak freely, to share information freely on these platforms, because what you're essentially doing is neutering people's political power before they've even fully realized that they have it.
Well, I want to ask our students to consider further, and to me what you have to say is inspirational. It relates directly to the way we're trying to teach this course, which is that we're trying to empower students to speak back to us and to see back at us by sharing visual as well as written commentary. In the Blue Book, old-fashioned exam, you couldn't really doodling and scratching, but that's
Right.
what most you could do. Here we think that we're trying to create an opportunity where there's a great deal more forward. How successful we are is another matter. But what you say is exactly where we ought to be going. I mean, this is what the technical abilities that we have ought to be liberating and invigorating our teaching styles, which have been all too much unidirectional, I think, in the past.
I agree entirely, and I think it's amazing that it's in the academy, and I know my students feel frustrated about this the same way that I do. It's as though Web 2.0 never happened, right? We have the tools that we have, like Sakai or eCollege or PowerPoint, to create information sharing spaces with our students are so woefully behind the times. It's like, it makes like Facebook version 1 look, like genius by comparison. It would be great, for instance, we have a screen in our classrooms. Every single person in the class has some kind of network device. Why in God's name don't we have standard issue technology that allows students to take images and information and put them up on the screen, to be curated by the professor while we're in class session? Right? I mean, it's unfathomable that we have not taken that basic dimension of our shared online cultural experience and integrated it into pedagogy.
Well, we're trying to do it. It's rather clunky, but we are trying to do it with immigrant experience. We're beginning. Seiko is behind the camera today, and so he and I didn't come from the same origins as students know, and we're trying to get all the other students to share their background stories on how it is they came to be in America with visual.
That's great.
Image. We're going to see how that works. Yeah. Well, I appreciate very much this
My pleasure.
conversation. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Professor Sinnreich.